There's an airport in Colorado that people can't stop talking about. Not because of delays, not because of the food, but because of everything else. The murals that make you uncomfortable without quite knowing why. The statue of a horse with glowing red eyes that killed its own creator. The underground tunnels that go further than any luggage system needs to go. The capstone in the main hall with strange symbols on it. Denver International Airport opened in 1995. Over budget, over schedule, and full of things that don't quite add up. And the official explanations, when they come, somehow make you more curious, not less. This isn't a story about aliens or lizard people. It's about the kind of strangeness that hides in plain sight. The kind that gets built into stone and steel and then just sits there, waiting for someone to look closely enough. That's the part people forget, or maybe never knew in the first place. Denver had Stapleton International Airport. It had been there since 1929. It was close to the city, maybe 8 miles from downtown, and by the time the 1980s arrived, it was handling tens of millions of passengers a year. It wasn't perfect. Airports rarely are. It had congestion issues, some noise complaints from the neighborhoods that had grown up around it over the decades, and a runway configuration that caused delays in certain weather. But it worked. People knew where it was. Cab drivers knew the route without thinking. Families knew how early to leave the house. So when the idea of building a brand new airport started circulating through Denver's city government in the mid-1980s, a lot of people looked up and said, essentially, why? It's worth sitting with that question for a moment, because it's easy to skip past it. We're used to cities growing, used to infrastructure being replaced or expanded. But this wasn't an expansion, this was a replacement. The plan wasn't to add runways to Stapleton or build a new terminal alongside the old one. The plan was to build an entirely new airport, from scratch, on 53 square miles of flat prairie land, about 25 miles northeast of the city. Stapleton would close. Everything would move. Tens of thousands of people who worked at or near Stapleton, everyone from airline employees to the shops and hotels that had grown up around it, would have to relocate or adapt. The scale of what was being proposed was, by any measure, enormous. And the location raised its own questions. The land chosen was far, not just a little far, but genuinely remote at the time. In the late 1980s, the area northeast of Denver, where the new airport would sit, was largely empty. Wind-scraped high plains, the kind of landscape that makes you feel very small and very exposed at the same time. There was no infrastructure out there, no highway built for that kind of traffic, no hotels, no services. Everything would need to be created alongside the airport itself, which meant the cost would be extraordinary. The initial estimates floated around $1.7 billion. That number, even then, struck some people as optimistic. Building an airport from bare ground in a remote location, with new roads and rail connections needed to make it accessible, with enough gates and terminals to handle the volume Stapleton was already managing, all of that added up to something that felt bigger than $1.7 billion. But $1.7 billion was the number that moved through city council discussions, that appeared in early press coverage, that gave the project a shape people could react to. Some reacted by simply asking again, quietly, why? Federico Peña was the mayor of Denver when the airport project began taking serious shape. He had come into office in 1983, Denver's first Hispanic mayor, young, ambitious, and genuinely interested in transforming the city's future. He believed, and said publicly many times, that Denver needed a world-class airport to compete as a major American city in the coming decades. Stapleton, he argued, was already showing its age and its limits. It couldn't be expanded in the ways the future would require. The land around it was too developed, the noise issues were real, and the runway layout created inefficiencies that newer airport designs had long since solved. These were not unreasonable arguments. Airport planners and aviation consultants largely agreed that Denver's long-term aviation needs would outgrow Stapleton eventually. The question was when, and whether eventually justified the cost and disruption of building something entirely new right now. That word, now, is where a lot of people got stuck. Denver, in the mid to late 1980s, was not flush. The city had gone through a difficult economic period, following the collapse of the oil and gas boom that had driven so much growth in the early part of the decade. Real estate had faltered, unemployment had risen, The kind of civic optimism that makes billion-dollar projects feel possible had been tested, and yet the airport project didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated through the harder years, which some observers found strange. You'd expect a project of that scale to pause when the economic winds shifted. Instead, it kept moving. The federal government was involved in the planning, as it generally is with major airport projects. The FAA was consulted. Federal funding was part of the picture from early on. But the degree of federal enthusiasm for the Denver project has been described differently by different people who were close to it. Some accounts suggest the federal interest was relatively routine. Others suggest there was something closer to active encouragement from Washington, a quiet pressure toward yes, that went beyond standard infrastructure support. That second reading, the one involving unusual federal interest, is one of the threads that conspiracy researchers would later pull at quite hard. But even setting aside the more speculative interpretations, the basic facts of the airport's origin story carry a kind of low-grade strangeness. A city with a functioning airport decides to build a new one at enormous cost in a remote location during an economically difficult period, and the project moves forward despite significant public skepticism. That's not a conspiracy. That's just a decision that raises eyebrows. People who were paying attention in Denver in those years remember a persistent feeling that something was being pushed through, that the usual process of public debate and democratic deliberation was happening, technically, but that the conclusion had somehow already been reached. The city held hearings, officials testified, numbers were presented and questioned, and then the project moved forward. There's a particular kind of institutional momentum that's hard to describe unless you've watched it happen. It's not exactly that objections are dismissed. They're heard, they're acknowledged, sometimes they're even incorporated in small ways. But the direction doesn't change. The decision, somewhere upstream from the public process, has already been made. What follows is more like explanation than deliberation. A lot of Denver residents who opposed the new airport, or who simply had serious questions about it, came away from the public process with that feeling, that the listening was real but the deciding had already happened somewhere else. Which raises a question that's simple on the surface and gets more complicated the longer you hold it. Who exactly decided? Not in the legal sense. Legally, City Council voted, the mayor signed off, the appropriate authorities approved. The paper trail is there. But decisions of this scale, decisions that reshape a city's geography and spend billions of public dollars, rarely emerge from a single room or a single moment. They're shaped by conversations that don't always make it into the record, by relationships between politicians and developers and federal officials, by the slow accumulation of interest from people who stand to benefit, whether financially, politically, or in ways that are harder to name. The land around the new airport, for instance. Once it became clear that a new airport was coming, that 5-mile stretch of empty prairie northeast of Denver suddenly had a future. Land values shifted. Certain people and entities had purchased or optioned land in that area before the announcement became fully public. That's not unusual in the history of large infrastructure projects. It happens regularly. Land speculation around anticipated development is almost as old as development itself. But it does mean that somewhere, someone knew enough about what was coming to act on it, and that someone, or those someones, had an interest in the project moving forward. None of this is hidden, exactly. If you're patient and willing to dig through county records and property filings and the business histories of Colorado real estate entities in the late 1980s, some of this picture comes into focus. Researchers have done that work. The picture that emerges isn't a clean diagram of villains and schemes. It's messier than that, more like a web of overlapping interests all quietly aligned around the same outcome. An airport that would be built on those particular plains, whether Denver was ready for it or not. The vote that formally committed Denver to the new airport project came in 1989, a ballot measure. The public got to weigh in directly, which felt democratic, felt like the right way to handle something this significant, and the measure passed. Not by a landslide, but it passed. Supporters celebrated. The project moved into a new phase. Ground would eventually be broken in 1989, with construction beginning in earnest in the early 1990s. But the vote itself has been examined pretty carefully by people who felt something was off about it. The campaign in favor of the new airport was well-funded and professionally run. The messaging was optimistic, future-oriented, full of the language of progress and competitiveness. Denver deserved better. Denver needed this. Denver would fall behind if it didn't act. The opposition was smaller, less organized, and made arguments that were harder to package into a bumper sticker. Their concerns were about cost overruns, about the distance from the city, about what would happen to the communities built around Stapleton, about whether the projections being used to justify the project were realistic. Those concerns turned out, in many cases, to be correct, but they lost the vote. After the vote, something shifted in how the project was discussed publicly. The debate phase was over. Now it was implementation. And in implementation mode, questions start to feel like obstacles rather than contributions. The people asking them start to seem, at least in official framing, like they're holding things up rather than helping things go right. That shift in framing is worth noticing because it's one of the ways that legitimate scrutiny gets quietly sidelined in big public projects, not by being censored or suppressed, just by being reclassified. You move from the question-asking stage to the doing stage, and anyone still asking questions gets subtly repositioned as someone who didn't get the memo. Construction began, and almost immediately, things started going sideways. The timeline started slipping in ways that felt significant, even early on. Delays in large construction projects are common enough that they barely make news. But the delays at Denver International were of a different character. They weren't just about weather or supply chain or the ordinary friction of building something large. Some of them were specifically tied to a system that had been added to the project's scope, a system that was, by any measure, extraordinarily ambitious. The automated baggage system. Someone, at some point in the planning process, decided that the new Denver airport would have a fully automated underground baggage handling system unlike anything that had been built before. The idea was that passengers would check their bags at the ticket counter, and the bags would be loaded onto small electric carts that would then travel through a network of underground tunnels guided by computer to the correct gate. No human hands would need to touch the bags between check-in and the plane. The system would be faster than conventional baggage handling, more reliable, and would reduce the labor costs associated with moving luggage around a large airport. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was a disaster. The company brought in to build the system, before anyone else automated systems, was working at a scale that had never been attempted. The tunnel network required was vast. The software needed to coordinate thousands of individual baggage carts across miles of underground track, routing them correctly, avoiding collisions, responding to real-time changes in flight schedules, was extraordinarily complex. And the system was being designed and built largely simultaneously with the rest of the airport, which meant that problems discovered late in the process couldn't be easily corrected without affecting things that had already been built around them. The testing phase was painful to watch or read about, depending on how you encountered it. Bags were shredded, carts collided, items ended up at completely wrong destinations. In one demonstration for journalists, the system performed so badly that it became something close to a dark comedy. Clothes scattered across tunnel floors, luggage bent into shapes luggage shouldn't be bent into. The computers that were supposed to be orchestrating all of this with quiet efficiency were, instead, producing chaos. The opening date was pushed back, then pushed back again. Each delay cost money, not just the direct costs of keeping construction crews on longer, paying for materials that were sitting waiting, maintaining financing on a project that wasn't generating revenue yet, but also the indirect costs, the airlines that had already restructured their operations around the anticipated opening, the businesses that had committed to the airport before it was ready, the city itself carrying debt on a project that was consuming more and more without producing anything yet. By the time Denver International finally opened in February 1995, 16 months behind its original schedule, the cost had grown from that initial $1.7 billion estimate to somewhere around $4.8 billion, nearly 3 times the original figure. That gap between what was promised and what it actually cost is one of the largest in the history of American airport construction, and it has never been fully and satisfyingly explained. Cost overruns happen, engineers will tell you that complex infrastructure projects almost always come in over budget, that the nature of building something unprecedented means you can't anticipate every problem. That's true as far as it goes. But the scale of Denver's overrun sits in a different category. Miscalculation accounts for some of it. The baggage system disaster accounts for some of it. Geological surprises, contaminated soil that had to be remediated, construction complications that genuinely couldn't have been predicted. All of that accounts for some of it. But some of it remains, even after all the reasonable explanations are applied, unexplained. Or at least inadequately explained. And it's in that gap, the space between the official accounting and the total that still doesn't quite add up, that questions began to take root. Not loud questions, not accusatory ones necessarily, just the quiet, persistent kind. The kind that surfaces at 2 when you're lying in the dark and your mind keeps returning to something that felt off. Where did the money go? That's the question underneath the question. Not just why did it cost so much more, but what specifically was being paid for. Because if the baggage system was a failure, if it was eventually scaled back and replaced with a more conventional system anyway, then the money spent building it was largely wasted. And wasted money on that scale leaves a hole in the accounting that someone, somewhere, would have had to fill in, or explain away, or quietly file under a category vague enough that no one would look too closely. There's a particular accounting term that shows up in large government and quasi-government projects when costs exceed projections in ways that don't fit neatly into existing line items. The term is contingency. It's not a dishonest term, not inherently. Contingency funds exist because complex projects encounter unexpected problems and need financial flexibility to respond. But contingency can also function as a category where uncomfortable numbers get parked, where things that are hard to explain publicly get absorbed into a figure large enough that no individual line item draws scrutiny. Nobody has proven that happened at Denver International. What people have noted is that the financial documentation around the airport's construction is, in places, unusually difficult to parse. Researchers who have tried to trace specific expenditures back to specific work have sometimes found themselves at dead ends. Records that should exist don't. Categories that should be itemized aren't. That might just be the ordinary messiness of a complex multi-year public construction project in the early 1990s, before digital record-keeping made everything more traceable. It might be something else. The automated baggage system was eventually stripped out of most of the airport. United Airlines used a version of it for a while in their concourse, but the grand vision of a fully automated underground luggage network handling the entire airport's bags was quietly abandoned. The tunnels built for it remained, and that's where things get interesting again, because the tunnels are still there, miles of underground passages beneath Denver International Airport. Some of them carry the partial baggage system that still operates. Some of them house utilities, mechanical systems, the infrastructure that keeps a large airport functioning. But some of them, according to people who have worked in and around them, go further than any of that requires. Extend into areas that don't correspond to any publicly documented system or function. That detail, the tunnels that go further than they need to, is one that airport officials have addressed in various ways over the years. Sometimes by explaining that the tunnel network is simply larger than the current operational systems require, built to accommodate future expansion. Sometimes by pointing out that large underground infrastructure often looks mysterious to people unfamiliar with how airports work. Sometimes, in more recent years, by leaning into the mystery with a kind of winking acknowledgement that yes, the tunnels are down there, and no, they won't tell you everything about them. That last response, the winking acknowledgement, is actually one of the more interesting things about Denver International as a cultural phenomenon. At some point, the airport stopped being purely defensive about the questions people were asking and started being something closer to playful, which is either a sign of genuine transparency and confidence, or one of the more elegant ways an institution can manage suspicion by appearing to embrace it. We'll come back to that. For now, it's enough to sit with where we are, an airport that many people didn't think Denver needed, built far from the city on empty planes, over budget by billions of dollars, delayed by more than a year, full of tunnels that extend further than their stated purpose requires, and not yet, in 1995 when it finally opened its doors, displaying any of the art that would eventually make it famous. That part was coming, and it would raise questions of a different kind entirely. There's something about a deadline missed that changes how you see everything that follows. Not always. Sometimes delays are mundane. A bridge takes longer than expected, a road project runs into winter, a building's opening gets pushed back a few months because of supply issues. You shrug. You wait. It opens eventually and you forget there was ever a delay at all. But sometimes the delay itself becomes part of the story. Sometimes the time that passes between when something was supposed to exist and when it actually does starts to accumulate its own weight, its own questions. And by the time the thing finally opens, you're not just arriving at a destination, you're arriving at the end of something that already has a complicated history. Denver International Airport opened on the 28th of February 1995. And for a lot of people who had been watching it, that date arrived carrying more than just the ordinary anticipation of a new building opening. It arrived carrying 16 months of missed deadlines, billions of dollars of unexplained cost, a baggage system that had become a national joke, and a low persistent hum of unease that nobody could quite locate the source of. The airport was real. You could walk through it. You could catch a flight from it. The gates were there. The terminals were there. The security checkpoints and the coffee shops and the rental car counters were all exactly where airports put those things. And yet something about it felt, from the beginning, slightly unlike other airports. Not dramatically. Not in a way that made headlines or that you could easily explain to someone who hadn't been there. Just slightly. The scale, partly. Denver International is genuinely enormous. At 53 square miles, it's the largest airport in the United States by land area and one of the largest in the world. When you're inside it, especially in the main terminal with its white tensile roof that's meant to evoke the Rocky Mountains in the distance, the space above you feels excessive, more space than people need, more ceiling than the activity beneath it requires. There's a particular kind of architecture that makes you feel small, not through intimidation, but through a kind of quiet indifference, as if the building was designed for a purpose that includes you but isn't really about you. Denver International has that quality, but the scale alone doesn't explain the unease. Plenty of large airports feel overwhelming without feeling strange. What set Denver apart, from the beginning, was the combination of scale and content, because alongside the ordinary furniture of airport life, the check-in counters and the gate numbers and the moving walkways, there was art. And the art was not ordinary. We'll get to the art in detail. That deserves its own time and its own careful attention. But before we go there, it's worth spending more time underground, because the tunnels beneath Denver International are, in some ways, the foundation of everything else that has been said and thought and theorized about the place. And they deserve to be understood as clearly as the available information allows, which turns out to be less clearly than you might expect. The original plan for the automated baggage system required a substantial underground infrastructure. The airport's 3 concourses, labeled A, B, and C, are separated from the main terminal by significant distances. Concourse B, which is the central one and the largest, sits nearly a mile from the main terminal building. To move passengers between the terminal and the concourses, the airport built an underground train system, a shuttle that runs through tunnels beneath the tarmac and delivers people to their gates. That system is visible and publicly documented and completely uncontroversial. The baggage tunnels are a different matter. The automated system required a parallel network of tunnels, separate from the passenger tunnels, through which the electric baggage carts would travel. These tunnels had to be large enough to accommodate the carts and their cargo, had to be climate controlled to protect luggage, and had to connect every check-in point in the main terminal to every gate in all 3 concourses. That's an enormous amount of tunnel, miles of it. And the tunnels had to be built before the baggage system itself was fully designed and tested, because the construction timeline required that the underground infrastructure be in place before the surface buildings above it could be completed. So, the tunnels were built, and then the system they were built for failed, and the tunnels remained. What happens to infrastructure built for a purpose that never fully materializes is an interesting question in any context. Sometimes it gets repurposed. Sometimes it sits dormant, sometimes it gets demolished. At Denver International, the tunnels were repurposed, partially. Some of them now carry utilities. Some of them carry the scaled-back baggage system that still operates in parts of the airport. Some of them, according to airport documentation, serve as maintenance corridor. And some of them, in the accounting of people who have worked in the airport's underground levels and have tried to map what they experienced against the publicly available blueprints, don't quite correspond to anything documented. That last category is the one that generates the most discussion. And it's also the one that's hardest to evaluate, because the primary sources are workers whose accounts are second-hand, whose specific observations are difficult to verify, and whose claims exist in that frustrating middle space between credible and unconfirmable. Several former construction workers and airport employees have, over the years, described tunnel sections that seem to extend further than the baggage or utility systems would require. Passages that led to spaces they weren't given explanations for, areas that were off limits without clear posted reasons. One account, which circulated in early internet conspiracy communities in the late 1990s and has been referenced periodically since, described a worker who had access to a section of tunnel that appeared to descend to a level below the main tunnel network, a sub-level that wasn't on any schematic he'd been shown. That specific account is unverified. The person behind it was never publicly identified in a way that allowed for independent confirmation. And the fact that it emerged in early internet conspiracy spaces, which were not known for rigorous sourcing, means it arrived already carrying a credibility problem. But it also arrived alongside enough other, more verifiable strangeness about the airport that people found it difficult to simply dismiss. Because here's what is documented, what exists in public record and has been confirmed by multiple independent sources. The airport's construction involved an unusual level of security around certain aspects of the underground work. Not unusual for an airport, necessarily. Security around construction sites is standard, but unusual in the specific areas where access restrictions were concentrated. Workers on certain underground sections reported being rotated out more frequently than was typical, a practice that can serve legitimate purposes, maintaining security by preventing any single worker from developing a complete picture of what they were building. But that also has an obvious application in situations where you don't want people to know too much about what's down there. There were also reports, during construction, of a significant amount of dirt being moved. More dirt than the documented tunnel network would account for. Earth removal at construction sites is tracked, both for engineering reasons and for environmental compliance. The volume of material removed from the Denver International site during construction has been examined by people trying to understand the full scope of the underground work, and the numbers don't map cleanly onto the documented infrastructure. Again, this could be explained. Large construction projects move earth for many reasons: foundation work, drainage systems, utility trenches, remediation of contaminated soil. All of these involve moving significant amounts of material that doesn't correspond directly to the visible structures being built. The contaminated soil issue at Denver International was real and documented. The site had a complex geological history, and the remediation work was extensive. But the numbers are large enough that the explanation of ordinary construction accounting leaves some researchers unsatisfied. And then there's the question of what the underground space at Denver International might be for, if it extends beyond what the documented systems require. This is where the conversation moves from the verifiable into the theoretical. And the theory that has attracted the most sustained attention, and that has the most grounding in real, documented programs, is the bunker theory. The idea that beneath Denver International Airport, possibly significantly beneath it, there exists a facility designed to house government officials and essential personnel in the event of a catastrophic national emergency. That idea sounds, stated plainly, like the kind of thing that belongs in a movie, but the foundation it rests on is not fiction. The United States government has a long and genuinely documented history of building underground facilities for continuity of government purposes. That phrase, continuity of government, is the official term for the set of plans and preparations designed to ensure that the federal government can keep functioning during and after a catastrophic event. A nuclear strike, a pandemic of sufficient severity, a terrorist attack on Washington. Whatever form the catastrophe takes, the theory is that certain essential functions of government, the chain of command, the ability to communicate, the capacity to make and execute decisions at a national level, must survive it. And, surviving it, in the colder strategic thinking of the Cold War era, meant having places to go that were hardened against whatever was coming. The most famous of these facilities is probably Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, also known as Site R, which has been publicly acknowledged and has appeared in enough journalism and government documents that its existence is not seriously disputed. It's a large underground facility carved into a mountain, designed to house Defense Department leadership during a nuclear emergency. It has its own power generation, its own water supply, its own communications infrastructure. It is, essentially, a small underground city built for the specific purpose of keeping certain people alive and functional when the world above is not. There's also the Greenbrier facility in West Virginia, which was built beneath a luxury resort hotel and was kept secret for decades before a Washington Post journalist revealed its existence in 1992. The Greenbrier bunker was designed to house members of Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. It had sleeping quarters, a hospital, a broadcast studio, decontamination chambers. It was maintained in operational readiness for roughly 30 years before the Post article effectively ended its usefulness as a secret facility. After the revelation, it was decommissioned and eventually opened for public tours. These are not theories, these are documented facts. The government built secret underground facilities during the Cold War. It maintained them. It kept them secret for as long as it could. And when they were revealed, the revelation was treated not as the exposure of a paranoid fantasy, but as a legitimate news story about real infrastructure that really existed. So the question of whether the government might have continued building such facilities after the Cold War, during the 1990s, when new threats were being assessed and old continuity plans were being updated, is not an inherently irrational question. It's a question with historical precedent. And Denver, as a location, has certain qualities that continuity planners might find appealing. It's in the interior of the country, far from the coasts that would be most vulnerable to certain kinds of attack. It's at altitude, which matters for some threat scenarios. It's connected to major transportation infrastructure, and it sits in a region with geological characteristics, deep, stable rock formations beneath the plains and foothills that are suitable for underground construction of the kind that serious continuity facilities require. None of that proves anything. Location advantages are suggestive at most, but they're part of why the bunker theory attached itself to Denver International specifically, rather than to some other large airport built in the same era. There's also the timing. Denver International was conceived and planned during the late 1980s, a period when Cold War continuity infrastructure was being reassessed in light of changing threat assessments. The Soviet Union was weakening. The nature of the threat was shifting, and government planners were thinking about what a new generation of continuity facilities might look like. Facilities designed not just for nuclear scenarios, but for a broader range of catastrophic possibilities. The late 1980s and early 1990s were an active period for this kind of thinking inside certain parts of the federal government. That's the context into which the Denver Airport project arrived. A massive construction project, partly federally encouraged, on a remote site with favorable geological characteristics, involving an unusually large amount of underground work, some of which remains imperfectly accounted for in public documentation. Is there a bunker beneath Denver International Airport? The honest answer is that nobody outside a small circle of people with the appropriate clearances knows for certain. The airport has denied it, repeatedly, and with apparent sincerity. Colorado government officials have denied it. The federal agencies most likely to be involved have not confirmed it. And absence of confirmation from agencies that routinely decline to confirm or deny the existence of classified facilities is, unfortunately, not the same as evidence of absence. What can be said is this: the Denver metropolitan area does have documented connections to federal continuity infrastructure. Cheyenne Mountain, about an hour south of Denver, houses the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, in an underground facility that is one of the most hardened military installations in the world. The relationship between Denver and federal underground infrastructure is not purely theoretical. It exists. The question is only whether it extends to the airport specifically. Former airport construction workers have given varying accounts over the years. Some describe nothing more unusual than you'd expect from a large underground construction project. Others describe things that don't fit the official map. A former baggage system technician who gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker in the early 2000s described being taken through a section of tunnel that, by his estimation, was not connected to any part of the airport's operational systems. He described it as going somewhere, without being able to say where. He wasn't claiming a bunker. He was claiming a tunnel that went further than it had any obvious reason to go. That kind of account is frustrating in a very specific way. It's not dramatic enough to be easily dismissed as fantasy, and it's not specific enough to be verified. It sits in the middle, which is exactly where genuinely uncertain things tend to sit. The airport's physical footprint is worth thinking about for a moment. 53 square miles. Most of that is surface area, runways and taxiways, and the open land required to keep a large airport operational. But 53 square miles is an enormous amount of real estate, and the portions of it that are not directly visible from any public area of the airport are vast. There are service roads and maintenance areas, and outlying structures that most passengers will never see or think about. The perimeter of the property is miles from the terminal. What happens at the edges of that perimeter, what infrastructure exists in the parts of the airport that aren't passenger-facing, is genuinely not something that public documentation makes clear. And then there's the financial question again. Because if the cost overrun at Denver International was partly attributable to underground construction beyond what the documented systems required, that would go some way toward explaining a gap that the official accounting doesn't fully close. Not all of it, not even most of it, necessarily, but some of it. The kind of sum that, if true, would never appear in any public record. Secret construction funded through the contingency and cost overrun categories of a large public infrastructure project is not without precedent in American history. It's not a comfortable thing to acknowledge, but it's true. Large projects with complex budgets and multiple contractors and layers of subcontracting create conditions where certain expenditures can be obscured without obvious fraud, just through the ordinary complexity of the accounting. None of this is proof. It's important to say that clearly and to mean it. The bunker theory is a theory. It rests on suggestive facts, on historical precedent, on the gap between what the documentation shows and what some workers describe, and on the reasonable observation that the government has done this before in other places and had reasons to think about doing it here. But it's a theory that lives in a space adjacent to things that are real. That's what makes it different from a pure fantasy. It's not a story invented whole cloth. It's a set of questions attached to a real place, a real budget gap, a real underground infrastructure, and a real history of the government building secret facilities in places the public wouldn't think to look. The airport is still there. The tunnels are still there. And whatever is or isn't at the bottom of them, the questions are still there too. Sitting in the dark, as questions tend to do, patient, waiting for someone with the right access and the willingness to look. There's a specific kind of discomfort that comes from looking at something you can't quite explain. Not fear, exactly. Not confusion either, though confusion is part of it. It's more like the feeling of a word that's almost on the tip of your tongue, something that should resolve into clarity but keeps hovering just before the point where it makes sense. You keep looking, you keep waiting for the image to settle into something familiar, and it doesn't quite. That's the experience a lot of people report standing in front of the murals at Denver International Airport. They were painted by Leo Tanguma, a Chicano artist from Houston who had spent much of his career making large-scale public works about struggle, resilience, and the relationship between human beings and the forces that threaten them. His earlier work had dealt with labor rights, with the experiences of Mexican-American communities, with the kind of historical weight that doesn't fit neatly into decorative art. He was not a painter of pleasant abstractions. He was a painter of things that mattered, or at least of things he believed mattered. When he was commissioned to create murals for Denver International Airport, he was given a theme. The airport, in its early conception, wanted art that engaged with the environment, with humanity's relationship to the natural world, with the consequences of human choices on the planet and on each other. That's a broad enough theme to accommodate almost anything. and what Tanguma produced was, by any measure, something. The murals occupy large wall spaces in the main terminal's baggage claim area. They're not tucked away. They're not in a corner where you might miss them if you weren't looking. They're in the part of the airport where arriving passengers collect their bags, where they stand and wait and have nothing to do but look around. The airport's designers put the most controversial art in the place where it would be hardest to avoid. Whether that was intentional or simply a matter of where the large wall spaces happened to be is one of those questions that sounds trivial but isn't. The murals are organized, loosely, into two sequences. The first sequence depicts destruction, suffering, environmental collapse, and what appears to be military violence on a civilizational scale. The second sequence depicts rebirth, harmony, and children of different backgrounds gathered together in a world that seems to have come through the darkness of the first sequence and arrived somewhere better. That arc, from darkness to light, from destruction to renewal, is a narrative structure with deep roots in human storytelling. It appears in religious texts, in mythology, in the literature of almost every culture. Tanguma has described his murals in exactly these terms, as a story about the path from suffering to hope, about the choices humanity must make to survive its own worst impulses. That explanation is coherent, it's internally consistent, and it still doesn't fully account for the discomfort, because the path from suffering to hope, as Tanguma painted it, runs through imagery that is genuinely disturbing in ways that feel excessive for an airport terminal. For a museum, for a gallery, for a space dedicated to art and reflection, the murals might land differently. But an airport is a transitional space. People are tired, or anxious, or already emotionally activated by the stress of travel. They're often with children. They're waiting. And into that waiting, the murals arrive. Let's spend some time actually looking at them. Not summarizing, but looking. The first of the two sequences begins with what can only be described as an apocalyptic landscape. A forest is dying. The trees are skeletal, stripped of life. Animals appear in the composition, some of them endangered species, some of them already extinct, rendered with a kind of documentary precision that makes their presence feel like an accusation rather than a decoration. The natural world is not thriving in this image. It's ending. And then the human element enters. A figure in a military uniform and a gas mask dominates one of the most discussed sections of the murals. The figure is large, filling the frame in a way that feels intentionally overwhelming. It carries a sword, not a historical sword, not a ceremonially abstracted weapon, but something that reads as actively threatening, as an instrument of ongoing violence rather than a relic of past conflict. The uniform the figure wears has been interpreted in various ways. Some see elements of Nazi imagery. Some see a more generic military authority. Some see a deliberately ambiguous combination of historical references, designed to invoke state violence without pointing at any specific historical actor. Tanguma has addressed this figure in interviews. He has described it as representing the forces of war and environmental destruction, the human systems that threaten both people and the planet. It is, in his framing, an antagonist in the narrative, the darkness before the light. The sword the figure carries is not being celebrated. It is being depicted in the act of causing harm, and the harm is the point. That reading is available in the mural. If you stand there long enough and look carefully enough, the narrative logic Tanguma describes is visible. The figure is not presented heroically. The destruction it's associated with is not glorified. But children appear in this section of the mural. Children lying in what appear to be coffins. Children of different ethnicities from different parts of the world, rendered with the same documentary precision as the extinct animals in the earlier section. They are not sleeping. The visual language of the composition, the stillness, the positioning, the context surrounding them, reads as death. This is the image that stops people. You can explain the narrative arc. You can cite Tanguma's intentions. You can place it in the context of social commentary and the long tradition of art that depicts suffering in order to generate reflection. All of that is available as a frame, and still, in an airport baggage claim, you are looking at children in coffins. There's a letter depicted in the mural, held by one of the children, written in what appears to be German. It has been translated as a poem by a young girl named Hummer Hirschenberg. who died in 1943 at Auschwitz at the age of 16. The poem describes a butterfly, its yellowness, its disappearance into the world above the ghetto walls. It's a real poem. It's a document of historical atrocity, and it's part of a mural in the baggage claim area of a commercial airport in Colorado. The decision to include that specific poem from that specific historical context raises a question that Tanguma's general thematic explanation doesn't entirely answer. Why there? Why that poem? Why, in a space dedicated to the mundane experience of collecting luggage before driving to a hotel or a family home, would you place a piece of text written by a child who was murdered in the Holocaust? The answer, if there is one, lives somewhere in the space between art and intention. Tanguma has said that he wanted the historical weight of human suffering to be present in the work, not as shock, but as witness. That the comfortable spaces of ordinary life, airports, public buildings, the places we pass through without thinking, are exactly where the memory of what human beings have done to each other should be kept visible. That forgetting is a form of complicity, and that art in public spaces is one of the few tools available against forgetting. That is a serious argument. It comes from a serious tradition of thought about public art and collective memory. It also doesn't fully explain why the airport commissioned it, why the commissioners approved it, and why, when the murals generated immediate and sustained public discomfort, they were left largely in place. Those are institutional decisions, not artistic ones, and they belong to a different set of questions. The second mural sequence is supposed to be the hopeful one, and in some ways, it is. The colors shift. The palette that was dark and ashen in the first sequence opens into something warmer, brighter. Children reappear, but now they're standing, moving, alive in the way children are alive when they're not in danger. They're gathered around a central figure, and the imagery of renewal and reconciliation is genuinely present if you're looking for it. But the path to that brightness runs through more strangeness. There is a figure in the second sequence that has attracted almost as much attention as the gas-masked soldier in the first. It's a large central character, a kind of messianic figure, rendered in a way that resists easy categorization. Some people have described it as angelic, some have described it as alien, some have pointed to specific visual elements, the proportions, the positioning relative to the other figures, the objects surrounding it, and argued that the figure is not a human being at all, or not meant to be read as one, but as something arriving from outside the human drama to resolve it. Tanguma has described this figure as a unifying force, a symbol of peace and international cooperation, the hopeful counterpart to the violent figure in the first sequence. In his telling, it represents the possibility of a world that has chosen differently, that has moved through the darkness of the first mural and arrived somewhere better. That reading is available. But the figure's visual construction is strange enough that multiple readings remain possible simultaneously. And in art, especially public art commissioned by institutions and approved by committees, the question of what a thing means and what it was intended to mean are not always the same question. Surrounding the central figure in the second sequence are children from what appear to be different countries or cultures, bringing offerings, or perhaps surrendering weapons. The gesture is ambiguous enough to support both interpretations. Some of the children are presenting what looks like military equipment, rifles, swords, tools of the kind of violence depicted in the first sequence, to the central figure, which could mean disarmament, the voluntary laying down of weapons before a unifying authority, or it could mean tribute or submission. The ambiguity is the thing. Art is allowed to be ambiguous. Good art often is. But in the context of everything else surrounding Denver International Airport, the ambiguity of the murals doesn't read as playful or intellectually generous. It reads as something you can't quite get purchase on, something that looks like it means more than it says and won't tell you what that more is. Several researchers who have examined the murals in detail have noted specific symbolic elements that appear throughout both sequences and that don't seem to belong to Tanguma's stated thematic framework. Small details in the composition, symbols embedded in the broader imagery, references that seem to point somewhere outside the narrative of environmental destruction and renewal that Tanguma describes. Some of these observations are straightforward pattern matching of the kind that finds faces in clouds, the human tendency to locate meaning in randomness. But some of them are harder to dismiss. There are geometric forms in certain sections of the murals that recur with a consistency that feels intentional. There are architectural elements depicted in the background of some scenes that don't correspond to anything. That needs to be examined and corrected. Is an institution that has not actually resolved the underlying problem. It has only declined a specific request. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, less than 2 years after Northwoods was rejected. The circumstances of his assassination have been debated continuously since the moment it happened, and that debate has generated more heat than light over the decades. Northwoods is sometimes drawn into those debates, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly. The existence of the document is cited as evidence that forces within the American government were capable of extreme action, which is true. Whether any such forces were involved in Dallas is a different question entirely, one that the Northwoods document alone cannot answer. What the document does establish, cleanly and without requiring any speculation, is that in 1962, a serious proposal for state-sponsored deception and violence against American citizens and interests reached the desk of the Secretary of Defense through normal bureaucratic channels, and that it was rejected quietly, without significant consequence for those who proposed it. McNamara lived until 2009. He was 93 years old when he died. In the last years of his life, he gave extensive interviews and cooperated with documentary filmmakers in ways that suggested a man genuinely wrestling with the consequences of decisions he had made. The Fog of War, the Errol Morris documentary from 2003, is one of the more extraordinary documents of that late-life reckoning, a film in which McNamara reflects on Vietnam, on Cuba, on the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the nature of rationality and its limits in the context of war. He doesn't mention Northwoods in that film. He doesn't mention it in the book that accompanied it. He doesn't mention it in the other interviews and retrospectives from that period. Maybe it truly seemed minor to him, in the context of everything else he had been through. Maybe it was one document among thousands, one rejected proposal among many, and the weight it carries now, after decades of public discussion, wasn't weight he ever assigned to it personally. Or maybe it was something he preferred to let stay where it had been for so long, in an archive, quiet, waiting for someone to find it. There's a tendency, when a dangerous idea gets rejected, to treat the rejection as the end of the story. The proposal failed. The safeguard worked. We can move on. But institutions don't work that way. When a specific proposal is rejected, the pressure that generated it doesn't disappear. It redistributes. It finds other channels, other forms, other proposals that accomplish something adjacent to what was refused. The goal doesn't go away just because one path to it was closed. Northwoods was rejected in March of 1962. The Cuba problem, as Washington understood it, remained entirely intact, and the operations that continued, the ones that were approved, funded, and carried out, tell a story that sits in uncomfortable proximity to the one that wasn't. Operation Mongoose is the place to start because it was already running when Northwoods was submitted, and it continued running after Northwoods was rejected. It was the Kennedy administration's primary covert action program against Cuba, and its scope was broader than most Americans knew at the time or know now. The program was overseen by Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a counterinsurgency specialist with a history of unconventional operations in the Philippines and Vietnam. He reported to a committee that included Robert Kennedy, the CIA director, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and other senior officials. The organizational structure was serious and well-resourced. This was not a fringe effort. It was a central priority of the administration. Mongoose involved multiple tracks operating simultaneously. There was a sabotage track. CIA-trained Cuban exiles conducting raids on Cuban infrastructure, targeting sugar mills, oil refineries, transportation links. The goal was economic disruption, the erosion of the Cuban government's capacity to function, the creation of conditions that might generate internal opposition to Castro. These raids happened. They were real operations with real participants who took real risks. There was an intelligence track, the development of networks inside Cuba, the recruitment of informants, the collection of information about the Cuban military and government. This was standard intelligence work that conducted under significant pressure to produce actionable results quickly. And there was the assassination track. The CIA's attempts to assassinate Castro are now part of the documented historical record. The Church Committee, A Senate investigation that ran through 1975 and 1976 examined these programs in considerable detail and produced a public report that named names, described methods, and established a factual record that had previously existed only in classified files and rumor. The assassination plots were numerous and, in some cases, almost unbelievably strange. There was a plan to contaminate Castro's cigars with a substance that would cause his beard to fall out, the theory being that his beard was central to his public image and its loss would humiliate him. This plan was apparently seriously considered. There was a plot involving a poisoned wetsuit intended to be given to Castro as a gift through an intermediary. There were multiple attempts involving poison pills, delivered through various channels. There was the collaboration with organized crime figures, specifically with mobsters who had operated casinos in pre-revolutionary Cuba and had strong financial and personal motivations for wanting Castro removed. The mob connection is worth pausing on because it illustrates something important about how the boundaries of acceptable action had shifted inside the American government by this period. The CIA was actively coordinating with organized crime figures, men who were simultaneously under investigation by the FBI, the same Justice Department that Robert Kennedy was running with his own anti-organized crime agenda. The right hand and the left hand were not only not coordinating, they were actively working at cross purposes. The CIA was enlisting people that Kennedy's Justice Department was trying to put in prison. Whether Robert Kennedy knew about the mob-CIA connection is a question that has never been fully resolved. The available evidence suggests he may not have known the specifics, though this strains credibility given his oversight role in Mongoose. What is clear is that the collaboration existed and that it operated within the broader framework of a program he was directly responsible for. None of the assassination attempts succeeded. Castro's survival through this period is sometimes attributed to luck and sometimes to competence. His intelligence services were apparently quite effective at identifying and neutralizing threats, and probably it was both. But the attempts continued repeatedly over a period of years, with a persistence that suggests the pressure to produce results never really abated. Alongside Mongoose, other programs were operating that shared its basic character, if not always its direct lineage. Psychological operations aimed at the Cuban population were ongoing. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, efforts to undermine confidence in the Castro government. These were standard Cold War tools and less ethically fraught than the assassination attempts, but they were part of the same general effort to destabilize a government through means short of open military action. There were also operations that involved a degree of deception not entirely unlike what Northwoods had proposed. Though more limited in scope, efforts to make it appear that internal Cuban opposition was stronger than it was. Efforts to create the impression of dissent within the Cuban military. Information operations designed to confuse and mislead Cuban intelligence about the nature and extent of American activities. The line between these approved operations and the rejected Northwoods proposals is real, but it is not always as clear as the fact of the rejection might suggest. The difference was largely one of degree and of target. Northwoods had proposed deceiving the American public directly, staging events that would manipulate domestic opinion through manufactured grief and fear. The approved operations were mostly aimed outward, at Cuba, at international audiences, at the Cuban population. But the underlying logic, that deception was a legitimate instrument of policy, that manufactured realities could serve strategic purposes, was shared. This matters because it complicates the narrative in which McNamara's rejection of Northwoods represents a clear moral line. The line was real, but it was drawn in a specific place, for specific reasons, and the territory on either side of it was not as different as the line's existence might imply. The Cuban Missile Crisis arrived in October of 1962, 7 months after Northwoods was rejected. For 13 days, the world sat closer to nuclear war than it has before or since, at least as far as the public record shows. Soviet missiles in Cuba, American naval blockade, back-channel negotiations, the real possibility that a miscalculation by either side would produce consequences that couldn't be undone. The crisis was resolved through diplomacy, a fact that still carries a kind of quiet weight when you consider how differently it might have gone. Kennedy agreed, secretly, to remove American missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. The public version of the resolution emphasized American firmness and Soviet retreat. The private version was more mutual than that. In the aftermath of the missile crisis, the most extreme pressure around Cuba began to ease. Not immediately and not completely, but the trajectory shifted. The sense that Cuba represented an existential and immediate threat, the anxiety that had made northwards conceivable, diminished as the immediate danger passed. Mongoose was scaled back and eventually shut down. The assassination attempts continued for a while, then gradually wound down. Cuba remained a source of friction, but the acute phase of the obsession began to subside. What didn't subside was the broader set of practices and assumptions that Mongoose and its related programs had normalized. The idea that the CIA could conduct assassination programs. The idea that the government could run large-scale covert operations involving organized crime. The idea that the executive branch could authorize significant actions with real consequences for real people, without meaningful congressional oversight or public knowledge. These practices and assumptions didn't end with Cuba. They migrated. They became part of the institutional inheritance that shaped American foreign policy through the 1960s and beyond. Vietnam, Chile, Iran. A long sequence of interventions and covert actions that drew on the same basic toolkit, the same basic reasoning, the same basic conviction that certain ends justified certain means. The Senate investigations of the 1970s, the Church Committee for Intelligence Matters, the Pike Committee in the House, attempted to map this territory and establish some accountability. They produced important public records. They resulted in some reforms, some new oversight structures, some limits on what the intelligence agencies could do without authorization. Whether those reforms fundamentally changed the underlying culture is a question that people who study these institutions continue to debate. The reforms were real, but cultures are more durable than rules, and the assumptions that made northwards conceivable, about deception, about acceptable cost, about the relationship between the government and the people it was supposed to serve, don't disappear simply because oversight structures are improved. There's a line that runs from northwards through Mongoose, through the programs that followed, not because each operation directly caused the next, but because of Everall's expressions of the same institutional logic, operating in the same institutional environment. Each one approved or nearly approved or approved in a modified form, represented a small movement in the same direction toward a conception of government action in which the population being governed was treated not as the principal whose interests were paramount, but as an audience whose perceptions needed to be managed. That conception didn't originate in 1962, and it didn't end when Mongoose was shut down. It continued in various forms through various programs, some of which are still classified and some of which will likely never be fully known. Northwards is the document that surfaced. It is not necessarily the most extreme thing that was considered. It is simply the one we can read. Something about the way secrets age is worth thinking about. There's an assumption when we talk about government secrets that the keeping of them requires constant active effort, that somewhere there are people whose job it is to maintain the silence, watching, managing, suppressing, that the cover-up is an ongoing operation sustained by intention and energy, and the continuous application of will. Sometimes that's true, but with Northwards, something different happened, something quieter and in some ways more instructive. The document wasn't aggressively hidden, it wasn't destroyed, no elaborate cover-up apparatus was constructed around it, it was filed. It went into the bureaucratic systems that process and store the enormous volume of paper that governments generate, and it stayed there, and for approximately 30 years almost nobody looked for it. Not because they were prevented from looking, but because they didn't know to look, or didn't think to look, or looked elsewhere. The silence around Northwards was largely a silence of indifference and institutional forgetting rather than active suppression, and that, when you sit with it, is almost more troubling than a dramatic cover-up would have been. A cover-up implies that someone knew the document existed and considered it dangerous enough to warrant concealment. What actually happened implies something different, that a proposal to stage attacks on American citizens was drafted, rejected, filed, and then simply not thought about again by the people who had been involved in it. It became administrative sediment, part of the geological record of a particular institution at a particular moment, present, technically accessible through proper declassification procedures if anyone requested it, but effectively invisible because invisibility was its natural state. To understand how this happened, it helps to understand something about the volume of classified material the American government produces. The numbers, even in the early 1960s, were staggering. Millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of classification decisions every year, material stamped secret or top secret or eyes only, filed in systems that were not always well organized, stored in archives that were not always well indexed, maintained by bureaucracies that were not always well coordinated with each other. In that environment, a document doesn't need to be actively hidden to remain effectively hidden. It just needs to be one piece of paper among millions. It needs to sit in a folder, in a cabinet, in a building in Washington, classified at a level that requires clearance to access, in a filing system that doesn't advertise its contents. Given those conditions, a document can remain effectively unknown for decades, without anyone making a single conscious decision to keep it that way. This is not a reassuring fact about government transparency. If anything, it's the opposite. The implication is that the classified archive contains not just secrets that are being actively protected, but secrets that have simply been forgotten, material that was sensitive enough to classify, but not important enough to anyone currently in government to actively manage. Documents that could be significant if found, but won't be found unless someone already knows to look. The Northwoods document fits this profile almost perfectly. After the rejection in 1962, the immediate principles moved on. Kennedy's attention turned to Vietnam, to the Soviet Union, to the thousand pressures of the presidency. Lemnitzer went to NATO. McNamara stayed at defense, but was consumed by the escalating situation in Southeast Asia. The Cuba obsession, while it didn't disappear entirely, began to recede as other crises crowded it out. The people who had drafted the proposal, the staff officers and planners who had actually sat down and written the specific language, who had thought through the operational details of drone aircraft and fake passenger lists and staged bombings, these people went on to other assignments, other projects, other documents. Whatever they thought privately about what they had helped create, none of them talked about it publicly. The institutional culture around this kind of silence is worth understanding. Military and intelligence organizations operate within strong norms of confidentiality, norms that are partly practical and partly cultural. Talking about classified work outside authorized channels is not just prohibited, but genuinely understood as a form of betrayal within these communities. The silence isn't just enforced from outside, it's internalized. People who spend careers in these environments develop a deep habitual reticence about their work that doesn't easily dissolve even after they leave, even after decades have passed. This means that even people who had direct knowledge of Northwoods, who had read it, discussed it, contributed to it, were unlikely to mention it in retirement, unlikely to include it in memoirs, unlikely to tell stories about it at dinner parties, not because they had been specifically instructed to maintain silence about this particular document, but because of the food. Silence about this kind of work was simply the default posture of the world they had inhabited. The 1960s moved quickly and violently. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. The Warren Commission investigation followed. Vietnam escalated dramatically through 1964 and 1965, consuming institutional attention and public concern in ways that made Cuba seem relatively distant. The civil rights movement, urban unrest, political assassinations, Robert Kennedy in 1968, Martin Luther King in 1968. The decade produced so much trauma and disruption that the specific anxieties of 1962 were buried under layers of subsequent history. The people who might have thought back to Northwoods in this period had other things to think about, and the document stayed where it was. The 1970s brought the Church Committee and the Pike Committee, the congressional investigations into intelligence community abuses that produced significant public revelations about assassination plots, domestic surveillance, and other programs. These investigations were important. They surfaced significant material, but they operated under time pressure, with limited resources, and they couldn't examine everything. The Church Committee's focus on assassination plots led it to certain documents and certain witnesses. Northwoods, apparently, wasn't among the material it examined closely, or if it was examined, it wasn't highlighted in the final reports. This is another mechanism of the 30-year silence, not just institutional forgetting, but the specific priorities of the people doing the investigating. Even serious, well-resourced investigations don't find everything. They follow threads. They pursue what seems most significant given what they already know. If Northwoods wasn't a thread anyone was following, it would remain where it was. The 1980s passed without the document surfacing. The Reagan administration was not a period of aggressive declassification of Cold War-era material. The general posture toward the intelligence community and the national security apparatus during this period was one of restoration and support rather than scrutiny. Whatever momentum toward transparency had been generated by the Church Committee era dissipated considerably. And through all of this, through 2 decades of American history after the proposal was rejected, the document sat, classified, filed, part of a vast archive that no one was systematically examining, in a political environment that wasn't particularly interested in examining it. The mechanism of the silence, then, was largely this: classification combined with volume, combined with the absence of anyone with the knowledge and motivation to specifically request this material. It's a mundane explanation for something that seems like it should have a more dramatic one. But mundane explanations are often the accurate ones. There's something worth sitting with in the human dimension of this silence as well. The men who signed Northwoods, Lemnitzer and the other Joint Chiefs, lived for years after 1962 as public figures. They gave speeches, they attended ceremonies, they were interviewed. Lemnitzer remained active in various advisory and ceremonial capacities well into the 1970s. He died in 1988, 4 years before the document that bore his signature became public. He never addressed it, not once in any public forum. What was it like carrying that? Not the guilt of it. We don't know enough about his inner life to assume guilt was present, but the simple practical fact of having signed a document proposing what Northwoods proposed, and then living for 26 years in a world where that document existed somewhere in an archive, where it could in principle surface at any time, where the question of what would happen if it did must have at least occasionally presented itself. Did he think about it? Did he consider it a minor episode, one rejected proposal among many in a long career? Did he believe, as the decades passed, that it was safely buried? Did he ever imagine it being read by people who would find it as disturbing as most people do? There are no answers to these questions. The record is silent on his inner experience of this particular silence. What the record does show is that the silence held for almost exactly 30 years. From March of 1962, when the proposal was submitted and rejected, to the early 1990s, when the conditions finally changed enough that the document could surface. Those conditions, the end of the Cold War, a specific piece of legislation, a specific investigation into a specific assassination, are what brought Northwoods out of the archive and into the world. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, it's worth staying here, in the 30-year quiet, in the space between a proposal being made and a proposal being known, in the gap between what governments do and what the people governed by them are permitted to understand. That gap is not unique to this document. It exists in various forms around various decisions in every government that has ever operated at significant scale. Most of what fills that gap is probably mundane. Administrative decisions, policy discussions, the routine machinery of governance that doesn't require public knowledge to function. But some of it is not mundane. Some of it is Northwoods. And the question that the 30-year silence raises quietly is not just about what was hidden in the past. It's about what is sitting right now in archives that haven't been examined yet, in filing systems that haven't been searched, in documents that are classified at levels that require clearance to access, in buildings where nobody is currently looking. The answer, almost certainly, is more than we know. How much more is the part nobody can tell you? The end of the Cold War changed something fundamental about the relationship between the American government and its own history. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a quiet shift occurred in the political calculus around classified material from the Cold War era. The justifications for keeping certain secrets had always rested, at least partly, on the argument that releasing them would damage ongoing operations, compromise sources, or hand advantages to adversaries. When the primary adversary ceased to exist in its previous form, some of those justifications became harder to sustain. The world had changed. The context in which the secrets had been created had changed, and the argument for continued secrecy became, in certain cases, more about institutional habit and self-protection than genuine national security. This shift didn't produce a sudden flood of declassification. Bureaucracies don't move that way. But it created conditions in which certain kinds of pressure for transparency could gain traction in ways they hadn't before. The specific mechanism that brought Northwoods to light was not primarily about Cuba, or about the Joint Chiefs, or about any of the direct content of the document itself. It came through a different door entirely through the Kennedy assassination. In 1992, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. The legislation was prompted partly by the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK the previous year. which had generated enormous public controversy and renewed interest in questions about what the government knew and hadn't disclosed about the events of November 22, 1963. The film was polemical and in many respects historically unreliable, but it accomplished something significant. It moved the question of Kennedy assassination records from the domain of conspiracy theorists and researchers to a mainstream political issue. Congress responded with legislation. The act established the Assassination Records Review Board, an independent body charged with reviewing government documents related to the Kennedy assassination and determining which ones could be released to the public. The board's mandate was deliberately broad. It was authorized to examine material from the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, the military, and other agencies. It could compel agencies to produce documents. It had genuine authority, not just advisory status. The board began its work in 1994 and operated through 1998. In that period, it reviewed millions of pages of documents and released an enormous volume of material that had previously been classified. Much of this material was directly related to the Kennedy assassination, the investigation, the various agencies' records of their own activities in Dallas, and afterward, the surveillance records on Lee Harvey Oswald and his contacts. This was the primary focus, but the board's mandate extended to related material records of programs and operations that might have bearing on the assassination or its context. And in that broader sweep, Northwoods surfaced. The document was found and released as part of the board's declassification process. It entered the public record quietly, without a press conference or an announcement. It became available to researchers and journalists as part of a large volume of material being processed and released over the course of several years. The initial discovery and public attention around Northwoods is associated primarily with James Bamford, an investigative journalist and author who had spent years studying the National Security Agency and American intelligence programs. Bamford encountered the document in the released records and recognized its significance. He wrote about it in his 2001 book, Body of Secrets, which examined the NSA but devoted considerable attention to Northwoods in the context of its broader argument about the American national security apparatus. Bamford's treatment of the document brought it to a wider audience. Before Body of Secrets, Northwoods was technically public. It had been released, it was in the archive, researchers with sufficient knowledge and motivation could have found it, but it wasn't widely known. After Bamford's book, it became something that journalists, documentary makers, and researchers began to reference regularly. The public response to the document, when it did reach a broader audience, is interesting to examine. By 2001, when Body of Secrets was published, the information environment was different from anything that had existed during the Cold War. The internet existed. Information moved differently. A document like Northwoods could circulate in ways that weren't possible when the Church Committee had done its work in the 1970s. And yet the public response was, in a word, muted. There was coverage. Bamford's book received serious reviews and was discussed in mainstream media outlets. The document was reported on. ABC News ran a segment on it that described the proposals in plain terms and noted their extraordinary nature. But the coverage didn't produce the kind of sustained national conversation that the document's content might seem to warrant. Part of this was timing. Body of Secrets was published in early 2001. By September of that year, the events of September 11 had occurred, and the entire frame through which Americans were processing questions about national security, government deception, and institutional trustworthiness shifted dramatically. The immediate context became overwhelming. Questions about 1962 receded even further than they had already receded. But timing alone doesn't fully explain the muted response. There's something else operating in the way the public received Northwoods that's worth thinking about carefully. The document required people to update something fairly fundamental about their understanding of their own government. Not just to learn that a bad thing had happened, Americans had learned plenty of bad things about their government by 2001, through Watergate, through the Church Committee, through Iran-Contra, through a long sequence of revelations about surveillance and covert action. The capacity for shock had been eroded. A certain baseline cynicism existed, but Northwoods asked for something specific. It asked people to sit with the documented fact that senior American military officials had formally proposed staging lethal attacks on American civilians, had written it down, signed their names, sent it through channels, and that this proposal had not resulted in meaningful accountability for those involved. That's a particular kind of uncomfortable knowledge. It doesn't fit neatly into the existing frameworks most people use to think about government wrongdoing. It's not corruption in the ordinary sense. Nobody was getting rich from Northwoods. It's not incompetence. The proposal was carefully thought through. It's something closer to a fundamental misalignment between the stated purpose of the institution and the values that were actually operating inside it. That kind of knowledge is hard to integrate. It doesn't produce a clear emotional response with a clear outlet. You can't vote it out of office. You can't prosecute anyone. The people involved were either dead or very old by the time the documents surfaced. And in any case, the proposal was rejected and never carried out. There's no villain to punish and no victim to compensate. There's just the document and the knowledge and the question of what to do with it. Most people, presented with that situation, do what humans generally do with knowledge that's uncomfortable and actionless. They absorb it partially, file it somewhere in the back of their understanding of how the world works, and move on. Not because they don't care, but because caring without any available action is exhausting in a specific way that the mind tends to route around. This is not a criticism. It's a description of a very human response to a very human problem. The researchers and journalists who continued to work with the document after it surfaced have produced a reasonably thorough public record of what it contains and what it represents. It appears in academic histories of the Kennedy administration and the Cold War. It's referenced in serious works on American foreign policy and intelligence history. It's taught in some university courses on American government and national security. It has a legitimate place in the historical record. What it hasn't produced is a serious institutional reckoning. No commission was established to examine how the proposal came to be, what it revealed about the culture that produced it, or what structural changes might prevent similar proposals from being generated in the future. No formal statement was issued by the Defense Department or the Joint Chiefs acknowledging the document and its implications. No apology was offered to the American public for the fact that its own military had once formally proposed attacking it. The document was released, it was reported on, it was discussed, and then the institutions whose history it revealed continued operating, largely unchanged in their basic structure, without any formal engagement with what the document said about them. That response or absence of response is itself a form of information. It tells you something about the relationship between institutional transparency and institutional accountability. These are not the same thing. A government can release documents that reveal significant wrongdoing and simultaneously decline to treat those revelations as requiring any response beyond the release itself. Transparency without accountability is a particular kind of performance. It allows an institution to say, truthfully, that it disclosed the information. It does not require the institution to do anything about what the information reveals. Northwoods was disclosed, technically, completely, without redaction. The full text is available. Anyone can read it. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the institution whose predecessors drafted it, issued no statement about it, conducted no internal review of its implications, treated its release as a historical matter, a document from a different era, something that had been properly handled through the normal declassification process and required nothing further. That silence, following the document's release, rhymes in an uncomfortable way with the silence that preceded it, different in character, but recognizably the same institution responding to the same document with the same basic posture. The archive released it, the institution absorbed it, the public processed it partially and moved on, and the document remained what it had always been, a plain, signed, bureaucratic record of something that was seriously proposed, quietly rejected, and then quietly forgotten by everyone except the people who went looking for it. There's a particular category of historical revelation that produces a strange doubling effect. You learn something that should change everything about how you understand a subject, and then you watch as almost nothing changes. The information exists. It's real. It's documented. And yet the world on the other side of that information looks remarkably similar to the world before it. Northwoods belongs to that category. In the years since the document became publicly known, it has accumulated a specific kind of presence in American culture. Not central, not marginal, but occupying a middle space that's hard to characterize precisely. It's well known enough that mentioning it in a conversation about government deception or Cold War history will produce recognition in many people. It's obscure enough that a significant portion of the population has never heard of it. It exists in the record, cited regularly in serious academic and journalistic work, and simultaneously fails to register as the kind of foundational revelation that permanently alters public understanding. Understanding why requires thinking about how information actually changes things, or doesn't. The naive model of information and public understanding works something like this. A significant fact is revealed, people learn the fact, they update their understanding accordingly, and behavior or policy or institutional culture shifts in response. The revelation produces a change proportional to its significance. This model is largely wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. Information doesn't automatically translate into understanding, and understanding doesn't automatically translate into change. There are filters operating at every stage, psychological, cultural, political, institutional, that shape what information reaches people, how they process it, and what they do with it. With Northwoods, several of these filters operated simultaneously. The first is what might be called the prior belief filter. When people encounter information that contradicts their existing understanding of the world, they tend to process it through the lens of what they already believe. Someone who already held significant skepticism about government trustworthiness would absorb Northwoods as confirmation. It fit an existing framework and required no fundamental revision of worldview. Someone who held a more trusting view of institutions would tend to minimize it. It was historical. It was rejected. It was the product of a specific, extreme circumstance. It didn't represent anything systemic. Neither of these responses required actually sitting with the document's full implications. Both allowed the person to maintain their prior framework, essentially intact, modified at the edges but not fundamentally revised. This pattern is not unique to Northwoods. It's how people generally process uncomfortable historical information. The document became, for different audiences, either evidence of how bad things already were, or a historical footnote that didn't require updating much of anything. The second filter is what might be called the actionability problem. Even people who absorbed Northwoods without minimizing it, who sat with its full implications and felt genuinely disturbed, faced a practical question. What do you do with this? The proposal was from 1962. The people who signed it were dead. The specific operation was never carried out. The immediate harm was zero. There was no villain currently in office to hold accountable, no ongoing program to stop, no specific policy to change. Information that produces disturbance without producing any clear action tends to be emotionally processed and then set aside, not forgotten entirely, but not integrated into active engagement with the world either. It becomes part of a background, understanding a general awareness that things are more complicated and potentially darker than official narratives suggest, without producing specific change behavior. This is psychologically understandable. It may even be psychologically necessary. Human beings can't sustain high-level engagement with every disturbing fact they encounter. The mind develops ways of categorizing and filing things that allow functional life to continue. Northwoods gets filed in a category: government wrongdoing, Cold War excesses, things that happened before, and life moves on. The third filter is institutional inertia. Even if a significant number of people processed Northwoods in a way that produced genuine concern and a desire for change, the institutions those people would need to change are not responsive to diffuse public concern about historical documents. They respond to organized political pressure, to specific legislative proposals, to crises that demand immediate response. A document revealing that something terrible was proposed and rejected 60 years ago doesn't create that kind of pressure, even if it arguably should. The Defense Department didn't change its internal culture in response to Northwoods becoming public. The Joint Chiefs didn't issue guidance about the kinds of proposals that are never acceptable to draft, regardless of strategic pressure. There was no internal investigation, no Inspector General's report, no formal acknowledgement that the document represented something that required institutional self-examination. This isn't surprising. Institutions don't typically volunteer self-examination in response to historical revelations unless they're compelled to. And in this case, no compulsion arrived. What Northwoods did change, more subtly, is something in the texture of public discourse about government deception. Before the document became widely known, certain kinds of claims about what governments were capable of proposing were treated as inherently implausible, as the province of paranoia, of conspiracy thinking, of people who couldn't be trusted to assess reality clearly. The existence of Northwoods made at least some of those claims harder to dismiss categorically. This is a genuine change, even if it's difficult to measure. It shifted, slightly, the burden of proof in conversations about institutional behavior. When someone argues that a government might consider staging a violent incident to justify a policy goal, the appropriate response is no longer simple dismissal. The documented fact that this was formally proposed at the highest levels of the American military means that the conversation has to engage with the specifics, with the evidence for or against a particular claim, rather than treating the category of claim as inherently incredible. That's a modest but real change in the epistemic environment. It has also, less helpfully, provided material for people who want to argue for things that aren't supported by the evidence. Northwoods gets cited in contexts where its relevance is questionable, used as a stepping stone from documented history to undocumented speculation. The logic runs, if they were willing to consider Northwoods, they were willing to consider anything. Therefore, whatever I'm claiming they did is plausible. This logic doesn't hold. The existence of one documented proposal doesn't establish the plausibility of all possible proposals. The specific circumstances, the specific pressures, the specific people involved in 1962 were what they were. Northwoods tells us something about what was possible in that specific context. It doesn't tell us that everything is possible in every context, but the document has been used that way repeatedly. It appears in discussions of events where it has no direct relevance, invoked as a general license for suspicion, rather than as a specific historical fact with specific implications. This has had the secondary effect of associating Northwoods, in some contexts, with the broader world of conspiracy thinking, which in turn makes it easier for people who want to minimize the document to dismiss engagement with it as conspiratorial rather than historical. This is a familiar dynamic. Genuine historical revelations about government wrongdoing often get absorbed into the broader ecosystem of conspiracy culture, and that absorption makes them easier to dismiss by association. It's an uncomfortable irony that document significance is in some ways undermined by the attention it receives from people who use it irresponsibly. What remains, when you strip away both the minimizers and the overreachers, is the plain content of the document and the plain implications of its existence. The plain content is what it is, a formal proposal from the highest levels of the American military to stage violent attacks on American citizens and interests in order to manufacture justification for a military operation. The proposal was rejected. The rejection mattered, but the proposal exists. The plain implications are several. That institutions under pressure can generate proposals that violate the most basic principles of the relationship between government and governed. That the culture of an institution shapes what can be proposed within it, and that cultures can drift far from their stated values under sufficient pressure. That rejection of a specific proposal doesn't resolve the underlying conditions that made it possible. That the public record of government action is incomplete in ways that are difficult to quantify, that what we know represents a fraction of what occurred, and that fraction was selected partly by chance and partly by the specific mechanisms of declassification that happen to surface certain material. These implications don't require conspiracy thinking. They don't require believing that Northwoods was part of a broader pattern of specific similar operations. They follow directly from the documented facts. The question of whether those implications have been adequately integrated into how Americans understand their government is harder to answer. There are people who have integrated them thoroughly: historians, researchers, journalists, citizens who have spent time with the material. There are people who haven't integrated them at all, who've never heard of the document, or who've dismissed it as a historical curiosity. And there is a large middle group who know about it in a general way, who hold it somewhere in their background understanding, who would cite it if pressed as evidence that governments sometimes do or consider extraordinary things, but who haven't let it significantly alter their relationship to the institutions it describes. That middle group is probably the most honest response to what Northwoods offers. Not certainty, not paralysis, not the abandonment of all trust in institutions, just a revision, quiet, permanent, slightly uncomfortable of what institutions are capable of when the conditions are right. The conditions that produced Northwoods were specific. They were also not unique to 1962. Pressure, failure, institutional culture, the conviction that certain goals justify extraordinary means these conditions recur. They're recurring somewhere right now, in some institution, in some part of the world, whether they're producing proposals similar to Northwoods, somewhere in a filing system that hasn't been examined yet, is a question the public record cannot answer. That's not a comfortable place to end up, but it's an honest one. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is probably the most useful thing a historical document like Northwoods can offer. Not conclusions, not certainty, not a clear map of what was done and who was responsible and what should happen next. Just the plain fact of what was written down by real people in a real institution, in a real moment of history, and the invitation to sit with what that means. Some things don't resolve. That sounds like a simple observation, maybe even an obvious one, but there's a specific kind of resistance in the mind to accepting it, a pull toward closure, toward the satisfying shape of a story that ends somewhere definitive. We want the document to mean something clear. We want the story to arrive somewhere. We want the discomfort to have a purpose, to point towards something actionable, to become useful in a way that justifies having felt it. Northwoods doesn't offer that, and the longer you spend with it, the more that refusal to resolve feels like the most honest thing about it. What remains, after everything, after the context and the signatures and the proposals and the rejection and the silence and the surfacing and the muted response, is something quieter than a conclusion. It's closer to a permanent revision of a certain kind of assumption. Not a dramatic revision, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that settles in slowly, over time, and changes the texture of how you hold certain ideas without changing the surface of how you present them. The assumption that gets revised is something like this: that the institutions built to protect people are, at their core, oriented toward that protection. That whatever failures and excesses occur at the margins, there is a center that holds a fundamental alignment between what the institution says it is and what it actually does when the pressure is high and the oversight is thin. Northwoods doesn't destroy that assumption entirely. It would be too simple to say it does. One document isn't the whole of anything, and the institutions of American government have, across their history, done real things to protect real people in real circumstances. The picture is complicated, and should be held as complicated, but the document does something specific to that assumption. It introduces a permanent uncertainty, a quiet awareness that the alignment between stated purpose and actual behavior is not guaranteed, that it can drift, under the right conditions, further than most people would find comfortable to accept, and that the drift can happen through normal bureaucratic processes, through normal institutional channels, through the work of people who believe they are being professional and responsible and serving the national interest. That uncertainty is not the same as cynicism. Cynicism would say, the institutions are corrupt at their core, the stated values were always a performance, nothing can be trusted. That's a different and less accurate claim than what Northwoods actually supports. What Northwoods supports is something more specific and more nuanced. It supports the claim that institutions are capable of extraordinary drift under extraordinary pressure, and that the mechanisms designed to prevent that drift are not always sufficient, and that the record of what actually occurs inside institutions is incomplete in ways that should generate appropriate humility about confident claims regarding what governments are and aren't capable of. That's a modest conclusion by the standards of dramatic revelation, but it's a real one, and it's durable in a way that more dramatic conclusions often aren't. There's a specific question that Northwoods raises that tends to persist even after you've absorbed the document's content and context. It's not about 1962. It's not about Cuba or the Joint Chiefs or Robert McNamara. It's about now in the broadest sense, about the present, about the institutions currently operating, about the classified archive currently accumulating. The question is simply, what else is there? Not in a paranoid sense, not with the assumption that whatever else is there must be as dramatic as Northwoods or more so, just in the plain honest sense that follows from what the document's history teaches about how institutional secrets work. Northwoods existed for 30 years without being publicly known. It was technically accessible, classified but present in an archive, retrievable through proper processes. It wasn't actively hidden. It just sat there, waiting in the vast accumulation of government paper that nobody was systematically examining. The mechanisms that kept it invisible for 3 decades. Classification, volume, the absence of anyone with the specific knowledge and motivation to request it. Those mechanisms still exist. The classified archive is larger now than it was in 1992 when Northwoods was released. The volume of classified material produced by the American government has grown significantly since the Cold War ended, not shrunk. The processes of declassification are slow, incomplete, and shaped by the priorities of the people managing them, which means that somewhere in that archive, with near certainty, there are documents that will produce in future readers something like what Northwoods produces in readers now, not necessarily similar in content, not necessarily proposals to stage false flag operations or manufacture pretexts for war, but documents that reveal something about the gap between what institutions say and what they do, between their stated values and their actual behavior under pressure, between the public record and the full record. Some of those documents would be released eventually, through the slow machinery of declassification and freedom of information requests and specific legislative mandates like the one that released Northwoods. Some will remain classified for longer than any currently living person will be around to read them. Some may be destroyed, quietly, through processes that are themselves not well documented. The incompleteness of the record is permanent, not temporary, not something that will be resolved with sufficient time and sufficient transparency. Permanent, in the sense that every government at scale produces more decisions than it documents, and documents more than it ever releases, and releases more than most people ever read. The full picture is not available and will never be available. This is not a counsel of despair. It's a description of reality that, once accepted, actually makes it easier to think clearly about these questions. If you expect the full picture, the incompleteness feels like a failure, like something is being hidden from you specifically. If you accept the incompleteness as structural, as a feature of institutions at scale, not a conspiracy against understanding, you can work with what you have more honestly. What you have includes Northwoods. A real document, fully available, thoroughly documented, describing a real proposal made by real people in a real institution at a real moment in history. It doesn't require embellishment. It doesn't require connecting it to other events through chains of speculation. It stands on its own as a piece of evidence about what institutions are capable of, and that evidence is significant. The most important thing Northwoods teaches may not be about the specific proposals it contained. Those proposals were rejected, and the circumstances that produced them were specific to a particular moment and a particular set of pressures. The most important thing may be about the process, about how a proposal like this moves through a bureaucracy, about how it gets drafted and signed and submitted through normal channels without anyone in that process apparently experiencing it as a fundamental violation of what their institution stood for. Because if the process is the thing to understand, then the question isn't just about what was proposed in 1962. The question is about what processes currently exist in current institutions under current pressures. What gets drafted? What gets signed? What moves through channels? What sits in inboxes and conference rooms and secure facilities, described in the careful, professional, measured language of people who believe they are solving problems? Most of it is probably mundane. Most of what any large institution produces is mundane. The extraordinary cases are extraordinary precisely because they're rare, because the normal functioning of institutions doesn't produce Northwoods every week or every year. But rare is not the same as impossible, and impossible is not the same as unthinkable. Northwoods was clearly thinkable because someone thought it and wrote it down and sent it to the Secretary of Defense. The question of what is currently thinkable inside current institutions under current pressures is not one that the public record can answer. By definition, the most sensitive proposals are the least visible. The things most worth knowing are the things most carefully controlled. This is where Northwoods leaves you if you follow it honestly to its end, not with answers, not with a map, not with certainty about what was done or what is being done or what might be done, but with a specific, permanent, calibrated awareness that the institutions human beings build to organize power are not reliably aligned with the values they claim to represent, and that the gaps between those things are real and significant and incompletely documented. That awareness is uncomfortable. It should be. It would be more comfortable to know that the rejection of northwards was the system working as designed, that the safeguards held because the safeguards were robust, that the culture that produced the proposal was anomalous and has since been corrected. It would be more comfortable to believe that the 30-year silence was the last such silence, that the archive has been examined thoroughly, that what has been released represents the full picture. None of those comfortable beliefs are supported by the evidence. What is supported is something more modest and more honest. The system has safeguards. The safeguards sometimes work. The rejection of northwards was real and mattered, and simultaneously, the conditions that produced northwards were not unique to 1962. The archive is not fully examined, and the record is not complete. Both things are true. They don't cancel each other out. They exist together, in tension, as the most accurate description of what the document and its history actually tell us. There is one last thing worth sitting with before this ends. Somewhere in the National Archives, the original Northwoods document exists as a physical object. Paper, ink, signatures, the actual pages that moved through actual hands in 1962. That physical object has outlasted everyone who touched it. The drafters, the signers, the people who reviewed it and rejected it, the people who filed it and forgot about it. It outlasted the Cold War that gave rise to it. It outlasted most of the institutions and rivalries and anxieties that made it conceivable. It is still there, quiet, available, part of the permanent record. Documents don't forget. They don't rationalize or minimize or move on. They just hold what was put into them exactly as it was put in, waiting for whoever comes next. Northwards will be read by people who haven't been born yet. It will be read in contexts we can't currently imagine, in a world shaped by events that haven't happened. And those future readers will encounter the same flat, professional, bureaucratic language describing the same proposals, and they will have to decide, as every reader has had to decide, what to do with that knowledge. What to do with the fact that serious people in a real institution once sat down and wrote this. What to do with the fact that it was rejected and filed and forgotten and found. What to do with the question it leaves behind, not about 1962, but about the nature of institutions and power and the relationship between those who govern and those who are governed, and the permanent unresolvable uncertainty about what is happening in the spaces we cannot see. That question doesn't have an answer. It just has to be carried, and carrying it honestly, without collapsing into either easy trust or easy cynicism, is probably the most useful thing any of us can do with what this document offers. It's a strange kind of gift, an uncomfortable one. From a filing cabinet in Washington to anyone willing to sit with what it says, the rain is still falling outside, the dark is still quiet, and somewhere in an archive, the paper is still there.